Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with Parshas Terumah. We'll first see the Ramban's introduction to the Parsha. And of course, this is sort of a new tack, not only on this specific Parsha. It's always, thank God, it's always a new Parsha at the beginning of the week. But this is the beginning of a series of Parshas dealing with the construction of the Mishkan. And this special mobile sanctuary that the Jewish people would construct in the desert. So it's the first Ramban on the Parsha. The Ramban says, "Kasher diber Hashem Yisrael panim b'fanim aseres hadibros." When God spoke directly to the Jewish people to convey to them the 10 Commandments, v'tziva osam aydei Moshe k'tzatz mitzvos shehem kamo avos mitzvosei shel Torah, and he conveyed to them some of the mitzvahs through Moshe. In other words, like he's referring to the 10 Commandments, that these are sort of like some of the foundational Torah mitzvos. Kasherin hugu raboseinu im hagerim shabo lis yaid. By the way, it's a very similar thing when a person wants to convert to Judaism. So the Beis Din ask them if they're ready to accept mitzvos. So they don't just say, "Are you ready to accept mitzvos?" They give specific examples. So how many examples do you give? You're not gonna say everything in all of the Torah. That's crazy. I mean, it'll go on forever and ever. So we sort of mentioned specific mitzvos. Do you accept this? Do you accept this? Do you accept this? We try to mention mitzvos that are considered to be sort of fundamental, and etc. But the Ramban says it's so interesting. That's what God did at Har Sinai. In other words, God wasn't going to teach the Bnei Israel all of the Torah and see if they accept it. But God conveyed certain mitzvos and said, "Do you accept these?" Yisrael kiblu aleim lasos. I have to confess, I'm misspeaking. Really, this has to do with the mitzvahs that they were given before the giving of the Torah as well, and with some mitzvahs they were given in that vein. And the Jewish people accepted them, and they made a covenant in all this. Now that they accept some of these mitzvahs, and in principle they take it upon themselves to accept all the mitzvahs, they are to the Jewish, to God a nation, and he is to them a God. And this was the whole mode that God had in mind leading into the giving of the Torah. He says, if you'll listen to my voice and you'll accept my covenant, and you'll be for me this special nation. And he said, you will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Vihinehem kedoshim ru'uyim sheyibahem mikdash lahasros shchinaso beineim. So now they're God's nation. Now what? God says to them, you'll be for me a holy nation. So now there has to be a sanctuary that will be a place where God will bring his divine presence to them, a place that they can celebrate and recognize that sacred bond with God. They're a different nation now. They're a different people. It's not the type of thing you just, wish yourself a yasher koach and you go home. So the Mishkan is the next step for that. And so therefore, after the acceptance of the Torah, we go straight to the Mishkan, because it's fundamentally connected to the acceptance of the Torah. Because now that they've accepted this, there needs to be a special place designated to God's name. V'sham yedaber im Moshe v'yitzavos bnei Yisrael, and that's where God will speak to Moshe, and there'll be instructions for the Jewish people. V'hinei ikra hachefetz b'mishkan hu makom menuchas hashchina. The primary function of the Mishkan is to be a place for the divine presence to dwell. Shehu ha'aron. That is the ark. God says to Moshe in reference to the Aron, I will present myself to you there, and I will speak to you from above the Aron. The Ramban says that's why the Aron is the first of the vessels of the Mishkan mentioned in this parsha, because that is the primary purpose of it all, because this will be a place for God's presence to dwell and for him to commune with Moshe. And then after it discusses the Aron, it discusses the table and the menorah. These were also very significant vessels in the Mishkan. These are the headline functions of why there's a Mishkan. So we start with them. Aval Moshe hiktim parshas Vayakel es a Mishkan es olav es mechseyu v'chein asa b'tzalel fishu aroy l'kadim b'masa. It's very interesting. So basically, there are 4 parshas that deal with the Mishkan. The first 2 are the instructions, and the last 2 are the implementation. Now, the sequence of how of how the instructions happened versus how the implementation is described is fundamentally different. So the instructions, we start with the Aron and the Shulchan and the Menorah. In terms of the description of what was done, we start with the boards and the cover, etc. Because that's what was done first. That's that famous medrash that Betzalel says to Moshe Rabbeinu, don't we have to build the house before we build the things that go in the house? That's the famous medrash. So the Ramban explains that's why the sequence is so different. But God wants Moshe to understand what's most important. That's the point here. V'soda Mishkanhu, Shia Kavod Sheshachan al Har Sinai, Shochen Alav B'Nistar. The core of the Mishkan is that the glory of God, which resided on Har Sinai, should reside in this Mishkan in a secluded way. Vayeshkon Kvod Hashem al Har Sinai. You have Sukkim by Har Sinai, by the giving of the Torah, that talks about the honor of God being there. So therefore, by the Mishkan, it says the honor of God filled with the Mishkan. Mishkan Shnei Pa'amim. It says twice by the Mishkan that the honor of God filled the Mishkan. Keneged es kvodo v'es gadlo. At the giving of the Torah, the experience of the Jewish people is described as seeing the honor of God and the greatness of God. So therefore, it says twice in the context of the Mishkan that the presence of God filled the Mishkan, and to cover those 2 bases. Vayba Mishkan tamid im Yisrael hakavod. The Jewish people could look at the Mishkan, and the glory and the clear divine presence there was sort of a recreation of the experience at Har Sinai. And Moshe could speak with God at the Mishkan, just as he did at Har Sinai. So we have a pasuk by the giving of the Torah that talks about God speaking to Moshe and the Jewish people by extension, and we have a pasuk by the Mishkan that speaks about God speaking to Moshe. Okay, I think we've seen enough of this Ramban. Now, what this Ramban is touching on is a very, very famous idea that the Mefarshim grapple with, and there's different approaches in the Rishonim. The Mishkan is a response to blank. So the Ramban would say the Mishkan is a response to the remarkable experience at Har Sinai. That's what the Ramban would say. Other Rishonim would say the Mishkan is a response to the sin of the golden calf. So it's a very interesting dynamic here. But the Ramban has painted a beautiful picture for how to think of the Mishkan. And by the way, it's so moving to think about. So many times, this is like Sheva Brachas kind of stuff, but so many times people talk about building a home as a mikdash ma'at, like a mini temple in its own right. The beautiful words of the Ramban, obviously not to be taken literally to apply to a person's home, but the spirit of it is what people are talking about. Talk about that it should be that in your home, people build a home. Hopefully it's true for all of us, that there's a feeling that there's a godliness within the home and there's a sanctity within the home. Okay, let's go on now to Pasuk Beis, verse 2, chapter 25, verse 2. Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yikli Terumah. God says to Moshe, speak to the Jewish people, they'll take from me donations. From every person whose heart moves him, take my offering. And this is the offering which you should take from them. We start talking about all these different materials that you should take from them. Fine. Let's see Rashi over here. It's not the first Rashi on Pasuk Beis. I think it's the third Rashi on Pasuk, maybe the fourth Rashi. It's the last Rashi on Pasuk Beis. Tikhu es trumasi. You should take my offerings, my donations. Amur Rabosenu, shalosh trumos amuros kan. It speaks of truma donation 3 times in these psukim. Achas trumas bekalagu goles. One donation is a certain set amount for every Jewish male over a certain age, and from that was made the sockets that would hold up the Mishkan. Then there was a set amount per person again, per Jewish male over the age of 20, from which the communal offerings would be brought. And then we have everyone just giving whatever they wanted. So that's alluded to by the fact that it talks about my truma 3 times in these psukim. There were 3 types of donations. There was the half shekel to make the sockets. There was the half shekel to buy communal offerings for sacrifices. And there was whatever people were moved to give. If you weren't moved to give, don't give. Whatever you wanted to build, really, the Mishkan. Okay, this is a very famous Rashi. I want to go to the Kli Yakar on Pasuk Gimel. Well, at least start the Kli Yakar. V'zos hatruma asher tikumei tom ladas razal ha'isa trumasam zu lekapara al zahav ha'egel. We mentioned this already. There's a midrashic approach. The idea of donating to the Mishkan was an atonement for a sinful thing for which they donated, right? In other words, they donated in a sinful way for the golden calf, even though we haven't read about it, the Parshios yet. But the point is they'd have that opportunity. They will do it soon enough, and they'll have that opportunity to donate. So now they should atone for that sin by donating for a mitzvah thing. This is a very different approach than Rashi said. If you look at an aspect of the donation as being an atonement for the sin of the golden calf, then he says perhaps the 3 different types of donations mentioned, alluded to, refer to 3 aspects, 3 sinful aspects of the golden calf. For 2 of them, everybody was in the same boat, and for the 3rd, it varied based on the specific individual. And therefore, 2 of the donations for the Mishkan, everybody gave the same amount, and for the 3rd, people gave different amounts based on their comfort level, based on their desires. So the most famous aspect of the sin of the golden calf is that the Jewish people accepted this as their God. You know what? I see it's already 9:45. I should have just held. So we'll see this tomorrow. I don't want to rush it. It's a very interesting thought for the Kli Yakar. But the bottom line is what he's going to do is he's going to say that the same way that there are 2 offerings that are same across the board and one varies based on the person, so there are 2 aspects of the sin of the golden calf that was the same across the board, and one varied very much from person to person. So that's how it's an atonement. So we discussed this morning the Ramban's introduction to how to look at the Mishkan, and we discussed this issue of the 3 times it talks about Terumah in these psukim.